Hey guys, I know this is a little different from the usual content I do. Don't worry, that will be back. Anyway, on with the video. Warning, spoilers for a 13-year-old game. So, a few months ago, I was really itching to get a new game. What I really wanted to get was Elden Ring. But since I don't have a machine that would run that game, I got the closest thing to that I could run. That being Dark Souls 1 Remastered. That's gaming on a budget for you. Anyway, prior to this point, I had never played any of the Dark Souls games, and apart from maybe Hollow Knight, I hadn't played anything with Souls-like design principles. So this was an interesting experience to say the least. Without further ado, this is what Dark Souls is like for an average gamer. If there's one thing that people say about Dark Souls, it's that you either have to be incredibly skilled or incredibly masochistic to play it. Anyone who's played it will tell you that Dark Souls is ridiculously hard, and ridiculously hard was what I was prepared for going in. And yeah, it's pretty hard. Dark Souls might be the hardest game I've ever played. However, having now played it and beat it, I don't think that Dark Souls is as hard as people say. Don't get me wrong, it's an absolute beast of a game. But it isn't nearly as much of a freakish nightmare as it's hyped up to be. And I say that as someone who considers himself to be a casual gamer. I might be in the upper ranks of that category, but I still think I'm within that category. I don't know, skill is on a spectrum, so categorizing is kind of weird. Anyway, you'll notice throughout this video that a lot of the footage I have included is of me dying. So yeah, the game's hard. Hard as rocks, boulders even. But through my entire playthrough, I was preparing myself for some crazy difficulty spike whenever I reached the hard part of the game, whenever that would be. But that difficulty spike never came. Dark Souls is well within the realm of beatable by a normal person. It's not stupid hard. It's not set at some ridiculous level of difficulty where only the gamer elite can overcome it. The truth is that Dark Souls is a punishing and difficult game, and a large chunk of players do not enjoy the experience that this design results in. But I think that anyone with some persistence and willingness to learn can beat Dark Souls if they want to. Or alternatively, maybe I'm just absolutely cracked at this game off the start. Moving on from general difficulty discourse, let's talk about Dark Souls' cruel side. Dark Souls is a game that pranks and trolls its players to a degree that I have never seen in another game. And that can be an okay thing or a very bad thing depending on the kind of player. There's a lot of traps and surprise attacks that a certain brand of gamer might find distasteful. If you've never played this game, just know that if you do, you will get outright pranked by the game over and over. This game's got falling barrels and boulders, wonky platforming, invisible bridges, enemies hiding in crates, enemies hiding behind doors, enemies hiding behind corners, NPCs that betray you without a second thought, jump scare boss fights that just about come out of nowhere, a convoluted world design with no map anywhere, which leads to you easily wandering into areas where you are in a prime condition to lose all of your ethereal currency, bloody mimics, and curses that reduce your max hit points by half even after you die and respawn. I was crossing this bridge in one of the early areas, and out of nowhere comes this dragon that one-shotted me with fire breath, and there was virtually no way to see it coming. Now, that didn't bother me a lot, because it only happened the first time I reached that bridge, and after that I could see it coming. But even if it happened repeatedly, I'd just know to not try using that bridge right now. But some people are going to get tilted at that kind of game design. My thought is, because I've been tricked once in a situation, I generally probably won't get tricked again in the same place. As long as you live by the philosophy of, if you haven't seen an enemy in 30 seconds, something bad is probably about to happen, it's not so bad when these kinds of things happen, because at least you can predict that they're coming. And sometimes it's even funny. Sometimes being the operative word. You know, just kind of accept the fact that the game's gonna screw with you a little bit. Or a lot bit when it's feeling like it. There were really only 2 times that I actually got frustrated with the game's punishing philosophy. The first time has to do with one of the save spots called Firelink Shrine, which becomes unavailable at a certain point in the game because this random punk stops by and kills the Firekeeper there. Like, come on man, Firelink Shrine is a central save point in the world. Not to mention that means that you can't use that Firekeeper anymore to upgrade your Estus Flasks, which is the game's primary healing mechanic, and I hadn't gotten to upgrading that at all yet. On top of that, it's just a really nice spot. It's got the music and the ruins and the weird NPCs, and now I couldn't use it anymore and it sucked. Luckily, you can eventually revive the Firekeeper and restart this fire, but not until the mid-game when you reach Anor Londo and hunt down the idiot punk who killed the Firekeeper in the first place. So you have to go without this bonfire for quite a while. The other time I was mad with the game's mechanics was with this section of invisible walkways. I shouldn't have to explain my issue with that. The biggest misconception with Dark Souls difficulty is, though, I think, the difficulty of bosses. The common wisdom is that the Dark Souls bosses are all massive pains that will kill you dozens of times. And yeah, you'll come across a few that are like that, but not every boss is such a pain in the butt. A lot of them really aren't that bad. Now, different people are going to have a harder time with different bosses. But for me, the Asylum Fatty, this weird dragon thing, and the messed up spider lady each only took me 3 tries. The Capra, the Four Kings, and the final boss each only took me 2 tries. And I beat Lava Boy, Pinwheel, Bone Boy, and these gargoyles all on my first attempts. And no, as you can see, I'm not typically using summons, and I'm not using a mage build, which is kind of a hidden easy mode for Dark Souls. So not every Dark Souls boss is crazy hard. There are some that are really nasty, like this pair of scumbags called Ornstein and Smo, or this curse-inducing dragon that is way nastier and remastered for some reason. But there's also a lot of bosses that are very manageable, even for new players like myself. And even if some of the bosses are absolute butts, I don't think that any of the bosses killed me as many times as those 2 stupid Anor Londo archers did on this railing. These 2 legends are the true final boss of Dark Souls, and you can't convince me otherwise. Another thing that you should know, if perchance you haven't played this dumb game, is that you'll probably need to look up some stuff on account of the menus and mechanics not being super well explained, but you definitely don't need a guide. When you boot up the game and there's no map, no quest list, and no markers telling you where to go, it can be easy to think that Dark Souls requires a guide if you want to play through it in any reasonable amount of time. I personally did not find this to be the case, and that may not be the same for everybody, but I didn't have a lot of difficulty navigating this game. I had to occasionally look something up, but it was just that, occasional. If you're someone who, like myself, finds that using guides saps the fun out of the game, or alternatively just finds guides to be distasteful, I'm just letting you know that while you might miss out on a couple of things if you play Dark Souls without a guide, the game is still totally playable without one. Dark Souls is also sort of non-linear, although I'm not sure if it adheres to that closely enough to call Dark Souls an open world game. Most of the time you have at least a couple of different challenges that you can try and tackle. The quests bottleneck at a couple of places, forcing you to accomplish specific quests before continuing, but for the most part you usually have multiple options. This is of huge benefit on account of the game's difficulty. If you ever get stuck, you could just try over and over again until you eventually succeed after dozens of attempts, and you could grind for hours to gain several levels and tilt the challenge in your favor. But you could also just go somewhere else, where there are other enemies and bosses to fight. Maybe those will prove earlier, and when you eventually come back to the initial challenge that was besting you, you'll be coming in with more experience under your belt, a fresh state of mind, and probably a stronger character with either a higher level or better gear, or quite likely both. This, I think, is another thing that makes Dark Souls approachable for a wider variety of players than just the gamer elite. Alright, I've ranted on about Dark Souls' difficulty, but now for the more important question. Is Dark Souls fun? Oh yeah, absolutely. But Dark Souls' main type of fun is satisfaction. The difficulty of the game makes succeeding at any given challenge drastically more satisfying than it would be otherwise. There is something innately fulfilling about mastering a system, and Dark Souls basically forces you to do that. Dark Souls is probably the quintessential example of why sometimes a single difficulty is a good thing for a video game. This feeling, the experience of mastering the game's mechanics, is what makes it fun, and that experience would be cheapened if it were any easier. To put it in a concise sentence, getting good is fun. Just a side note as well, you may have noticed that in most of my footage there is little to no blood flying on the hits. That's because you can turn most of it off in game settings. If you're someone who's looking for a real challenge but isn't all about that blood and gore, you can absolutely turn it off. Anyway, on with the script. Okay, I've ranted about the game difficulty and design principles long enough. Let's talk about how the game looks and feels. The atmosphere in this game is palpable. The environment is harsh and unforgiving, and that aesthetic is enforced through the challenging gameplay. It's a great example of how narrative and mechanics can complement each other. The story itself is vague and largely opt-in. If you don't care about the plot, that's fine. It is in no way integral to the core gameplay. For those who want it, however, there is a great trove of assorted lore to be acquired from NPC dialogue and item descriptions. The core story is pretty simple, and perhaps a bit dark, which is to be expected from a game called Dark Souls. And hey, a lot of people find that to be to their taste. I'm kind of neutral on dark fantasy myself, because some dark fantasy is dark, but it can then use its grim tone to support and strengthen a story or theme. But then some other dark fantasy is just dark for the sake of being dark. I think this game, Dark Souls, falls somewhere in the middle between those two extremes. The plot is rather nihilistic, but it's also enjoyable in its own way. The game's themes of humanity are occasionally mildly thought-provoking, and many of the characters are interesting and likable, if not a little bit creepy on the side. There are multiple endings to Dark Souls, but at first glance it seems like it doesn't matter which one you choose. In the first ending, you're putting off the inevitable coming of a darker age, and in the other ending, you just let that darker age arrive. The darkness comes eventually anyway, so you could argue that it's better to just let it happen and be done with this cycle of staving it off. On the other hand, there is definitely virtue in preserving things that matter, even if those things can't last forever. It is implied that there may be some good reasons for the Age of Darkness to come, since the preservation of light is artificial. But it's up to the player to decide which course of action you think is most fitting. However, and this is a side note of sorts, there's not an input necessary to trigger the second ending. If you're curious and you walk down the wrong pathway after defeating the final boss, which is what I did, you'll inadvertently accidentally trigger ending 2, which means that if you wanted to get the classic ending, you'll need to play through the entire game again. You do keep all of your health and upgrades if you play on the same save file, but the difficulty also goes up, with the enemies scaling to have more health and damage. So I couldn't tell you if it's a faster or shorter playthrough than the initial one, because I haven't played through it a second time yet, and I don't know if I will. My last complaint with the game is not one that is applicable to a large percentage of players, and this may come off as weird, but I don't care, I'm leaving it in anyway. I'm a Christian guy, and as such, there are a couple of NPCs and one boss that I thought had, shall we say, distastefully immodest character designs. The one boss that was like this was one of just 2 places in the game where I used summons, purely so that I could beat it in the lowest number of attempts possible. Immodest characters are few and far between in Dark Souls. I think there's only 3 of them in the game, and you don't have to interact with any of them more than once. But to the small demographic of my viewers who are fellow believers or who hold some conviction regarding this kind of thing, you should be aware that there is some of that stuff sparsely scattered into the game. Overall, I give Dark Souls a 6 out of 10. I don't think that I can recommend it for most people, and I don't know if I'll ever play through it again on a fresh file, but the one time was pretty fun, and if I had a machine that would run Dark Souls 3 and such, I'd probably try those out at some point as well. If you really want to play and beat Dark Souls, you probably can, regardless of your current gaming skill level. But it is really hard, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of losing, and that experience definitely isn't for everybody. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't have a real outro or conclusion written up for this, so I'm just going to throw some spicy takes here at the end to mess with the veteran players. 1. Blighttown is not a bad area. The platforming of Blighttown is kind of fun, and the dark filter doesn't really matter much because there's only a few ranged enemies in the entire area anyway. The only really annoying part about Blighttown is the poison. Apart from that, it's a fun and largely unoffensive area. 2. The gargoyles are really easy for being a boss fight with multiple opponents. Sure, there's 2 of them, but they're both so predictable that it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. Since they have long wind-ups, like most bosses in Dark Souls, and one of their attacks is a long fire breath, they can stand stationary for a long time, and that makes it easier to temporarily split them up and fight one at a time. And 3. Curse frogs are actually a really interesting and innovative enemy. Yeah, I'm lying about that one. Curse frogs are absolutely stupid.